Hello there. Who are you?
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Killing must feel good to God, too. He does it all the time. And are we not created in his image?
We all go a little mad sometimes.
After all, murder is, or should be, an art.
I could kill you now pretty easily. Do some interesting things before anyone showed up.
What are these films you can't wait to look at?
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast and the 18th episode of our series dedicated to on-screen serial killers of horror film and TV history. I'm your podcast host, Anna Bogatskaya, and in this episode, I'm going back to my roots, talking about a generically Eastern European serial killer, of course. Joining me is the brilliant film critic Sabina Petkova, first-time guest on the show, to discuss Esther, the protagonist/villain of the Orphan series. First up, we'll be talking about 2009's Orphan, starring Isabel Fuhrman as the aforementioned Esther, a 9-year-old Russian girl adopted by an American family. Things quickly turn very dark once Esther joins the family, though, because of course they would. Otherwise, why would I be covering about it on this podcast in this series? It's a film with a fantastically operatic twist that will be discussed in detail in this episode, but I will not be giving it away in this intro. If you haven't watched Orphan yet, do yourself a favor this Friday night and go watch it. It's a very, very fun time. Then come back to this episode. We also cover Orphan First Kill, the 2022 prequel that nobody wanted or expected, and yet delivered another delicious dose of madness. Please note, this conversation contains all manner of spoilers for both films. If you want to show your appreciation for Esther or myself, you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or let me know what you think of this episode or any other episode specifically on Spotify Podcasts. You can also go to Patreon and show your support there, or just find and yell at me online at Anna B. Demented. And with all that said, please enjoy our take on Orphan and Orphan First Kill. You know what? I think it's really beautiful that two Eastern European film critics have convened to talk about an Eastern European lady killer like Esther.
It's one of the few things, I guess, that I can shine with at some point in the critics scene, basically. I'm happy to embrace that, and I'm super, super, super happy to be talking to you, of all people, about these films and about horror, killers, and all the beautiful stuff in between.
Well, that's lovely to hear. And Sabina, since it's your first time on the Final Girls podcast, I need to ask you what I ask everyone who comes on the show, which is, what is your own personal relationship with horror?
Well, I think at the beginning of my cinephilia, as many people can relate to that, of course, growing up in Bulgaria in a very non-cinephiliac family and no real access to our house cinema, whether on DVD or in a small independent screening room. I just torrented a bunch of horrors in the early 2000s and watched them all the time. I think I got my first computer at age 9, so that was it. All the shebang, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Wrong Turn 2, all of anything like this was my film education. I did not have the notion of cult or classic or something that is more renowned than others. It was just whatever was on the torrent website. That is it.
Oh, I love it. The wild, wild west of the internet in the early and mid 2000s. That was some real dark times, but also very formative times.
Exactly. Yeah. And ever since, it's only grown. Like, my love for horror has never ceased. It's always been there. I find it was defining in many ways. So
What do you think of when you think of movie serial killers?
You know, I was thinking about that particular topic. Was it in the 2018 or 19? And there was this big surge, I guess, of talk and discourse around it with a Zac Efron film and Fatih Akin Golden Glove and House That Jack Built as well. There was this convergence of few different perspectives, and I remember just drowning in the impossibility to articulate what irks people that much. For me personally, I've always liked it. I think I've been conditioned to enjoy most of these films, even if I feel quite uneasy. I do embrace that uneasiness, being put into different perspective, and perspective that you do not want to have, aka the killer's perspective, or empathy. So all these moral considerations that were brought in. I always find it quite difficult to talk to people about it, so I'm super happy we have we have this opportunity. Yeah, I feel like it's...
How come?
Maybe if they're not like devoted horror fans, I think the threshold is I don't know, lower, I guess. There's more talk about the moral side of filmmaking rather than the actual execution of scenes. And, I still remember people were saying, oh, why does a film like The Golden Glove, why should it exist? It's so ugly, it's so repulsive, it's so awful. It's not of its time anymore. We're past that. So that often felt like shaking it off instead of actually delving into why do we find it really hard to talk about these films? Obviously, you are doing this whole season, so nobody is finding it hard, but it's very, very useful to have this as a document for the future, your series, to just go deep and wide.
Well, it's so interesting what you bring up because, I was really agonizing over to cover The House That Jack Built, The Golden Glove on the series, and I'm not. Partly because I really disliked The House That Jack Built, not because I was particularly disturbed by it, because I found it really dreadfully boring. But what you bring up is so interesting because what's disturbing sometimes is the extreme ugliness of these films. Murder and serial killers are not beautiful people. They're not stylized like they are in Hannibal. So when filmmakers or storytellers stylize it and make it into something that's gorgeous to look at, that also is disturbing in its own right. So there's no way for this subgenre to win, really. You're either making it too pretty or you're making it too ugly, and both are uncomfortable to look at.
Yeah, and I do feel like there's inherent value in that. The lack of comfort in looking at it. But also, in films like Orphan and Orphan First Kill, there's just a great time to be had. I mean, it's difficult to talk about empathy in these two particular films. So maybe because it's not from the perspective of a grown-ass man serial killer that is targeting women. So that's the other thing, right? The violence against women that makes it hard to disentangle from the plot of the film.
And there's a lot of violence against women here as well, and it goes in both directions. Thank you for giving me a perfect segue to talk about Orphan and Orphan First Kill, the 2009 film and its 2022 prequel. Very odd and fabulous texts. Tell me, what is your relationship with both of these films? When did you first watch Orphan? Did you have a particular set of expectations going into it?
So I was thinking about that, actually. And the first one I saw was First Kill.
No!
Yeah.
Sabina!
Yeah, it's so weird. It was completely random recommendation from a friend of mine in the beginning of last year, actually. And I had no clue.
Oh my God.
I often do this guilty as charged, like going into films blind, prequel, sequel, 15th film of the director and just see where it takes me. But I think what I took from that film was I just went to my texts and I texted my friend, my resolution for 2023 is to be more unhinged. I think it's gonna work. Quite well inspired by Orphan First Kill. So that was the relationship. I absolutely loved it. Every second of it. I had an amazing time with it. One-liners were perfect.
Incredible.
The psychoanalytical parts of it were super compelling. So after that, I went to the first one and then did a rewatch in the chronological order of their release. So that was my experience, and I really want to hear what have I missed by starting with the second one.
That is wild, because I'm gonna have to throw all my questions out the window, because that is completely changes your relationship with the film, because you're meeting Esther for the first time as an adult woman who is a killer, and you're seeing her pretend from the start. You're in on it with her. And when I watched the first Orphan, and I have to say, and it was probably around the time that it was released. I didn't watch it in the cinema, but maybe like 2010 or 11, shortly after. And I have to say, I fully expected it just to be sort of trash. I just expect it to be maybe a fun time, maybe a spooky kid film. I really love those, because I generally find kids spooky by default anyway, so it's already tapping into my own fears. But I didn't know about the twist, and I love the twist. I found her, it totally changes the way you see the film and how everything unfolds. I rewatched both of these last night, and I hadn't watched the first Orphan for a while. And I was looking at it for the first time, knowing what the twist was. And it's a completely different film, and it completely changes how I perceived Isabel Fuhrman's performance and Esther. And by the time the prequel came about, I was a bit sniffy, as I tend to be about over-sequelizing or prequelizing everything. And also because it was just but curious, because it felt like an odd choice to do a prequel so long after the original film came out. Like,
yeah, right?
Why so long? Isabel Fuhrman had grown up. You can't even get away with the same pretense anymore. Not really. It requires so much suspension of disbelief, But then when I saw it, because I heard a friend of mine, a friend of the podcast, Jordan Cruciola, talk about it rapturously on her podcast, Asterian. And I ran to it. And whereas Orphan is very much, and we'll talk about this, kind of a 90s in tone psychosexual horror film, Orphan First Kill is like Ryan Murphy levels of cuntiness. It is very much kind of an offshoot of the Eat the Rich vibe. Julia Stiles, who has done a couple of sort of, remakes of classic horror films. I have never seen her perform in this way. And I loved every second of her. I loved how it changed up the dynamic. It found a way to change up the dynamic between Esther and the audience, and Esther and her surrogate parents, in a way that felt smart. It felt clever, and it felt like it understood what the original Orphan did, that worked very well with the audience, but wasn't. It did a bit of repetition, but it wasn't always constantly just doing the same, rehashing the same scenes.
I don't know if surprise is the right word, to be fair. It feels like it was a passion project and made with so much love from everyone involved. In some way, they all gave their best to make up something to justify its own existence, in a way. As in, the film itself stands on its own 2 feet, even if the odds are stacked against it.
Totally.
As well as, having a prequel that long after. And also, a prequel is a weird choice, especially with the timeline. One could expect maybe a sequel where she's still alive and doing something afterwards. But I'm very happy that it came into existence in a very even happier that I got to experience that in reverse. I'm always really, really fucked up by the chronological order of prequels that when they come after. Similar with X and Pearl,
Yes.
I always struggle to recommend like which one should you watch first. I can make up a perfect case for either or. But it's this is my own journey into it, and to be fair, like this is my big disclaimer. I am a film critic and I do write about films a lot, but my memory is super poor. I have enormously bad memory when it comes to plot and narrative and twists. So I'm very happy that I get to write about some films. So I have an actual detailed recording of what I've seen. But apparently a year and a half was enough for me to almost completely forget the twist in The Orphan. So I had a little bit of that.
I love that for you.
Watching the first one, it's just, I'm just constantly submerged in this childlike wonder with every film. I may have seen it before, but most of it, it would take me a long time until it catches up with me that I've seen it and I know what's happened. So
what a blessed way to exist. I'm very jealous of this.
Thank God for neurodivergent brains. Oh God.
So let's talk a little bit about the first Orphan and our introduction to Esther.
Yes.
Tell me about what you think of Esther as a character and her whole living doll vibe that she's got going on. She's adopted. She's supposedly Russian. She's adopted by this American couple who already have 2 children. They're played by Vera Farmiga and Peter Skarsgård. And they've had a stillborn 3rd child, and sort of in an effort to possibly get over it, possibly substitute the 3rd child who died, or as Vera Farmiga's character says at one point, kind of, she has so much love to give to this 3rd child. Instead of giving it to her other 2 kids, she wants to have a 3rd one. How do people around her, both adults and kids, react to Esther when she arrives in America?
I really like this setup because it's familiar enough, and at the same time it's already eerie. There's a lot of substitutions going on, or just alluded substitutions, I guess, which is not exactly foreshadowing, but it opens up the space for Esther to seem, I don't know, weird, but also not that weird. Because everyone at first is nicely surprised by how well behaved she is. Yes. What was it they called her? She's so well mannered. She is lovely. She is soft spoken. The living doll aspect works for her so well. But I have to say as well, like you said, I also find children a bit creepy to begin with. So for me, I was like, I am never trusting that little lady. No way.
Yeah, especially when she's dressed like, one kid tells her at one point, dressed like a Lizzie Borden. I'm like, you know what? It's a deep cut for a child. I respect that kid. But also oh God, my mind just went to a place. Let me just tell you this anecdote. When I was a small child, there was one point where I got given a nearly life-size for a small, like 4 or 5-year-old kid doll. Okay. And at one point, a girl doll. A girl doll. And I liked the dress on her, and I wore the doll dress for a while because I liked the dress so much. And I put my clothes on her.
Why wouldn't you?
I mean,
it's just right there.
It's
right?
just fashion in it. But I just suddenly remembered that I probably at one point, when I was an actual child, not an adult, 5'9" woman, I don't think I could pass as a child at any point. But at one point as a kid, I did also wear doll's clothing.
I think I've always been fascinated by dolls' clothes anyway, but it was always so small. So I remember there was some of the children's movies where the dolls would be life-size, etc., like before Barbie came around. So I'm sure I've also fantasized about this. Pretty good image to have, though. I like it.
So, but back to Esther. Sorry for that digression. How does she weaponize her whole kind of polite, doll-like approach?
Okay, I think this is the point where I would invite us to go deeper into her background and what it means for the film to position her as foreign, as an orphan, and also as disabled, right? In some way. They don't use that word per se, but she has supposedly this condition. I feel like there's convergence of factors that are that weird me out. You know, this always the thing of seeing an Eastern European character put in that position of threatening or weirdness or allure. But you can already sense that there's something else behind the allure. So from the very beginning, her accent is off-putting. Like the one of the sisters, she says, "Oh, she came from Russia, but her English is so good. You would be surprised how good her English is," which is a classic marker of othering, right?
Yeah, put a finger up if you've heard that today.
Oh my God, every day of every hour, every year.
Yeah, every day of my life since I was 6 years old.
Yeah, your English is surprisingly good. So Esther, I feel you. But yeah, her mannerisms are pronouncedly artificial, I think. Did you get that same feeling? For me, that's where the contrast comes, where people are inclined to believe her so easily. And I'm just sat there like, no.
Well, what was really interesting rewatching the film last night and knowing that you and I specifically were going to talk about this, and I didn't plan it this way, but I was thinking about the fact that we're both, immigrants in London, that we both come from Eastern European roots. And I was looking at Esther for the first time, actually, through that lens. And was picking up on all these little details about how she's othered, but also how she plays into this role of subservient, polite, perfect child. Perfect according to a very harsh reality, and one that she's making up because she's not a child. She's a woman cosplaying a child. And it's almost like, is her behavior what Esther thinks a good child should be? Which I found very interesting. And the other element, of course, is how when she moves to America, she then becomes not just not a threat on the surface, but she then becomes a sort of a lesser than person, in the sense that, and this might get a little bit thorny, but I find it very interesting that we rarely talk about whiteness when it's kind of essentially a nearly all white cast, and the subject matter of the film is not about race. But I found myself looking at it through that perspective, how because Esther is Eastern European and she's, told to be Russian, but then she's actually from Estonia. And in the film, they're kind of interchangeable. There's a really cringy scene where Vera Farmiga's character is like being like, "Oh, does anybody speak English?" Is it just like talking at people. And I remember thinking, oh, she's just so easily kind of thrown aside. Because even though this is an entirely white family, within them, she's still one notch beneath them. Because she's in the hierarchy of whiteness, she's at the bottom of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And obviously this is within the context of the film and the casting decisions, etc. But it's the funny thing about how Eastern Europeanness has been perceived as lesser than. As you said, there is a colonial logic between East and West, between West enough and not West enough, between white but not white enough. And it's
Yes.
really hard to articulate these things out loud sometimes without a lot of contextual backing. But I've noticed that even in academic publishing, I guess it's a bit easier when I've done research to see how colonial discourse is related to Eastern Europe as a geopolitical space and the social heritage and basically social formations that come afterwards. But in normal parlance and regular talk about films, I think it's really hard to discuss it like that. But I'm very happy that you pointed it out in this film. It's precisely that, and the idea that Russia, also if we have to be very meticulous about it, the Eastern Europe is such a made-up space.
Yes.
Estonia and Russia, and me, I don't know, coming from Bulgaria, is so geographically dispersed, and yet it's still the same umbrella term, which works. And she herself, Esther herself, identifies as such. And I think that's another reason for her to try even harder to mimic and to do the mannerisms and to pass as better than the American kids in order to be picked up.
And I don't think this is the space to get into also, because Esther is supposed to be born in 1970 something, so she's not even Russian or Estonian, she's Soviet.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a whole nother point of conversation, that's for another space, because we can spend an hour just talking about what does this mean about her, about her post-Soviet identity and how she's weaponizing that and how that's been weaponized in American horror and mainstream films as well as kind of a default villain with a very thick Russian accent, But
it's so funny about her accent, though. It comes and goes. And I think I never really noticed. I don't pay attention to accents too much in films, but in this case, because all the other characters were talking about it, I was like, there is no accent. And then at some point in the middle of her third or fourth sentence, she would say something in a thick Russian accent and then would pull it away. So it was a very interesting accent work that seemed a little bit sloppy, but I think also in that meta interpretation, it worked really well to match Esther's superior knowledge of basically the rules of her game.
Yes. So how does she interact with the parents separately? Because she starts very quickly to build relationships with every single member of the family kind of independently of each other. How does she connect with them?
Yeah, and it's such an interesting family, this one, I think. It's not the nuclear family already, and one of the children, the small girl, she is deaf. So that's also an interesting intersection between sign language, where she picks it up really fast and can have all these conversations with the little girl without the barriers of English, Russian accents and all of this. So that's also quite interesting. I would love to talk about the relationship between her and the little sister.
Totally.
Because it's more nuanced, I guess.
You bring up a really interesting point, because after we find out who Esther really is and the fact that she's, suffers this rare disorder, her connecting more intensely with the other disabled kid is another thing that completely changes the film for me.
Exactly. Though I was thinking about we cannot think of Esther without manipulation, right? So it would be misleading to say, oh, she's actually nice to Max, the other little girl, because that is not the case. Yeah. But there is some sort of kinship, which I found quite interesting in comparison to the way that Esther approaches other women, basically. It seems like Max is the only girl that gets a little bit of extra affection or whatever Esther is capable of,
And why do you think that is?
I would be inclined to say and related to the disability intersection, I guess, that intersectionality and that kinship. Hopefully it would also be because she's 5 years old or something.
Yeah.
That would be nice. But the film shows that Esther is not nice to any 5-year-old girl anyway.
And I think there's an element of the little girl not being a threat to her relationship with the dad, who she begins being very interested in. So how does she work? Because I think she's working both of them. How does she work both the dad, John, and the mom, Kate?
This is perhaps the most interesting part of Orphan for me. That deconstruction of familial dynamics and going straight for the jugular of Freud, you know? It's exactly the Electra, whenever, or if it ever existed, I don't know, but it really attacks that concept of the Electra complex. And
Can you briefly explain what the Electra complex is?
Based on the Oedipus complex, I guess, Freud came up with something that could be, in a way, related to women, whereas in the Oedipal complex, supposedly, young boys, in order to, ascertain themselves as people, they have to transfer their love from their mom, and eventually to grow up and see the dad as the primary figure. They have to basically experience a desire to kill their dad and marry their mom. So supposedly the Electra complex is the reverse opposite gender-wise. So the young girl seeing the mom as a threat and for the affection of the dad. And this is exactly what we see way before we realize she's not even a kid. So at this point I was hooting, hollering, thinking it's really funny to see that very questionable psychoanalytic idea played out quite literally. Because Esther she did the exact amount of, she gave Kate the exact amount of sweetness in order to lure her in enough to then start diminishing her in a very harsh way and gaslighting her, that I found really fucking scary. At the same time, as she was alienating Kate, she was bringing in John closer and closer. But I struggle to actually describe the way she does it, so I would love to hear how you would put it in your own words, because I was just so profoundly affected by how gross it was.
Well, it was so interesting to watch it, knowing what her plan was all along, right? Because as you're watching the movie, you're just, for the first time without knowing the twist, you think, oh, it's just a fucked up kid. What does she want? And when you discover that it is extremely, almost violently sexually frustrated woman in her 30s, plus with all the added layers of, this is an immigrant, that's an immigrant posing, it's a serial killer, it's a disabled woman, it's a woman with a very rare, invisible, you would say, disability. She's not perceived or treated as such. And I found the film to be so much about Kate in a way that I misremembered it. It's so much about her wanting this picture perfect family and being so frustrated by the way, not just frustrated by the fact that her child dies, which is no one's fault and is a tragedy, but then frustrated that this girl that she quote unquote gives all her love to doesn't want it or doesn't fit the image that she wants to build. And then when she starts gaslighting her, it becomes a thing of, oh, it's her or me. So it's this, on the surface, mother fighting against a child that she adopted, against a child. And the way that Esther knows exactly, figures out very, very quickly how to go for the jugular with Kate. There's a scene where she tells her in this very sweet, girlish voice, "It must be frustrating for someone who loves music as much as you do to have a son who isn't interested and a daughter who can't even hear." And Vera Farmiga's face in that scene is of just utter disbelief. Does she know what she's saying? Or she doesn't? So it's either you're functionally evil and you mean to harm, or you don't mean to harm, but you're doing harm anyway, both of which are bad. And obviously even the situations where she riles her up to the point where she slaps her in public, she only needles her when they're alone together to get her to the point to break in front of other people, because we know, and it's genuinely the understanding, that it's never the child's fault. But in this case it is. And it completely turns around, I think, our experience as viewers, because yes, as much as I love seeing kind of evil kids on screen, the instinct is still to protect children. The instinct is still to believe children and to protect them from any harm. But as we see her kind of isolate everyone, the moment where it comes to, this very strange pinnacle is just shortly before the twist when she's trying to seduce John.
Oh, that scene.
I cannot believe that a Jaume Collet Serra movie, a 2009 horror film, got away with actually making a scene of a quote-unquote child seducing a grown man not problematic.
I know.
Wow.
It's so impossible for me to even begin to think. Like, so many things could have gone wrong, but believe me, the last thing I was thinking about watching this scene was, why did they make this? How did they make this? I was so immersed in the scene. At this point, you have enough information on Esther, and you've seen her gaslight and use things against Kate for so long that you cannot be on her side, really. And there's this new, the pinnacle of her plan, I guess, and of her image. I really find that combination between doll-like preppiness and borderline sexiness, because she's going for a vamp-like look. With the cat eyes and all black dresses, which she's never worn before, and red lipstick and proper grown-up girl makeup, right? And you can see that is so perfectly placed. It's not a girl playing dress up and putting her mom's makeup without knowing what she's doing. And is so composed. Her pose and her cadence and her really, really, really precise movements and glances throughout the film. Like, Isabel Fuhrman is so good and so much in control that I find it quite scary. That weaponization of femininity in that scene, of course, was freakish.
And do you know what I found also really reminiscent of? And I fully expected it to go in this direction when I first watched it, and obviously the twist completely changes it, and I think that's why it's so clever. There was a moment in the 90s where this sort of, quote-unquote psycho nymphette was a real character that appeared a lot in films. So it's like, what if this like very what if Lolita was and I'm using this fully knowing that we have all culturally misinterpreted Lolita very badly, but this figure constantly appeared, mostly played by Alicia Silverstone, of it's this teenage girl who is very sure of herself and weaponizes the way that especially older men look at her, and then, either kills them or tries to kill their family to take them for herself, etc., etc. It's kind of essentially being on Humbert side in the Lolita narrative, being like, no, but she really was going after him though, And obviously Esther, Lena, her real name, is an adult woman. So she actually is fully aware of what she's doing. But I think herein lies the real, not tragedy. I think tragedy is a too big and too sad a word for Esther. But the crux of her is that her sexual frustration is so deeply ingrained in her that I think it's like her main motivator. Because if you think about it, if she tries to seduce a man and he goes with it, he's a pedophile. But if they reject her, she's getting rejected because they look at her like a child and not as an adult woman. So it's a lose-lose for her.
Yeah, because she's already chosen to live within the lie of that appearance, and some of that has been conscious choice, some of that has been circumstantial. We don't know enough of the backstory to infer, but she has fully leaned into that lie of a lifestyle, and therefore all bets are off. But at the same time, she's condemning herself to sexual frustration and to never being liked or seen for who she really is, which that really has a tragic ring to it.
And I find the scene of the twist reveal to be really interestingly done, because it's cross-cut, as we discover through exposition and Kate calling around Estonian hospitals. We see it intercut with the unmasking of Esther. She's taking off the makeup after John rejects her. She's crying. She's unbinding her breast. She's taking out the fake teeth. How did you find the reveal of the real Esther after she takes the mask off?
I always find these scenes in films really, really interesting. Rather than the masking, I prefer the unmasking of a character quite a lot, because of the symbolic function, I guess. But in this case, I struggled to see her differently at first. She was still Esther, also because of the makeup, which was a bit, it was a bit too much already to begin with. But the more time I spend on her face, and I think at that point the camera does show us a lot more of her face without makeup and without any other faces in the frame, we have enough focal points to maybe spot and infer age on that face a little bit. I don't know if it was like the twist working really well with my brain, so I would, I don't know, notice some texture on her face that wasn't there before.
I noticed it too.
It's weird.
Yeah.
It's weird.
It was like sallower skin, just kind of skin that had sort of, as you do in your 30s, sort of loses its elasticity. But I thought it was, relatively subtly done.
Yes, yeah, for sure. In the way that it left me wondering, did I see it, or was I just like really willing to see her differently now? Basically, this film got me on board from beginning to end. And I liked the montage quite a lot, to be fair. I was longing for it at that point. I was like, okay, let's see how this is going to be done. And I think it was quite impactful to spend time with her alone like that, because we've been locked out of the bathroom where she's taking a bath. We don't see her in this film by herself that much, I think.
You're right.
She's joined, for example, by Max or by the mom or by the dad when they're painting, but we don't have that much access, or we don't spend that much time with her in her room, so we don't know what she's up to on purpose, of course. But yeah, in this case, we were let in.
And even when she's taking a bath, she makes a whole big thing with Kate about locking the door and not letting her in.
Yeah, which at first I was like, okay, trauma, I guess. From Eastern Europe, you always gotta lock the door because someone is gonna come and see you. It's a weird suggestion. But then afterwards, when she started unbinding, it's like, okay, that was always there in the background.
I was thinking as well about the scene when we figure out what Esther has been doing, when we discover those sort of images that she's drawn in. It's this like night glow paint that she uses that can only be seen with a black light. And I love the idea that for the entire movie up until this point, she has been much like those images, which are all kind of, pornographic fantasies between her and John. She has been hiding in plain sight. She's been the lead of our film for the entire time, but we until pretty much the last 15 minutes or so of the film, we don't actually know who she is or what she actually wants to get out of it. Because up until this point, up until the reveal, what is it, do you think, that kind of drives her violent urges?
Yeah, I feel like the notion of sex is introduced early on when she has this quote-unquote primal scene witnessing of Kate and John having sex in the kitchen. But it's left ambiguous, it's left unexplored, so I didn't really think of sex until that late in the film. I think I did not have much reference for her drive in a way. I was thinking about that boys and girls from, her age, from school, they were mean to her. There was always some sort of pushback, and then there was retaliation. So I think the film was very clever at the beginning in framing these kind of interactions between her and the other kids as just revenge, and being bullied and then seeking revenge. So that threw me off. Was off the track. It was pretty cool. I did not expect it, but then when the psychosexual thing started to appear, I was just nicely surprised, and I thought the paint, the 2 layers of the paintings was so clever, and I thought it was a great metaphor for just subconscious urges that always creep up and are left unsatisfied. And of course, at this point, when I watched it, I had completely forgotten about the origin of that paint thingy in the next film. So I was like, oh my god, what a great metaphor. It still is, I guess. It still works that way, but now we have an explanation for why that is.
And what do you we've spoken a lot about the characters and what drives Esther, but what do you think of the actual filmmaking itself? And particularly I'm interested in, I find the tone of the film to be really a really curious one.
I think I was surprised by how well it's shot. I think it was really well put together, and it didn't overuse point of view shots. Like, for example, it's quite conventional in many ways, but it did go out of his way to signal the arrival of a new person that is going to change the story very early on. I remember I had noted this when John and Kate go to the orphanage. There is a point of view shot from above, from a window, someone watching them. A disembodied shot, which is fairly expected in the genre that we're dealing with, of course, but I really appreciated the fact that the film did not overuse it. It happened like a couple of times in the film, and I thought that was quite tasteful. And when it comes to tone, yeah, I think the way that the camera was not too obnoxious about its own presence It was not stylized, too stylized, this film at all. I think that helped it.
Yeah, I mentioned it before. I think this film accomplishes something that we talk about very often, but rarely see, which is really capture the tone of a 90s mid-budget thriller. And I have a very soft spot for that era of filmmaking and for that particular tone. And I've seen over and over again how, because of the way that the nostalgia machine works, the films have constantly tried to pitch themselves as a 90s style film, whatever that means. But whatever that means, I think, is the most difficult thing to get in a film, which is tone. It's not the clothing. It's not the needle drops. It's not a certain hairstyle. I think there's almost like a certain face and a tone that is built through all of these different choices. And somehow, and I'm going to struggle to explain even why, but I think Orphan gets it. You know, when I look at films like Hitman, you know, Hitman has been, the Richard Linklater film that has just come out recently, has been spoken about in the same breath as kind of, oh, you know, we want this mid-budget 90s vibe film back. We want more of them. I was like, yeah, but when I was watching Orphan, this feels like it. This feels like The Hand That Rocked the Cradle. This feels like Poison Ivy. This feels like While You Were Sleeping. This feels like Speed. You know, all of that particular no frills. Let's get cracking. Let's get cracking with the story. Let's get cracking with the characters. Let's get cracking with the violent set pieces. There are almost no jump scares, which is very much, you know, a 2000s thing that we overuse, and I'm not a particularly big fan of. But I found the violent set pieces to be so effective.
Yeah, for sure. In a way that, I look at this film and then I find it hard to believe that it's made in the 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
It seems, I could see it more of a 90s film than a 2000s. And I'm pretty sure what you spoke about really gets to why that is.
I want to start talking a little bit more about Orphan First Kill, and it's so interesting to hear your perspective on it, especially because you saw this first. But having revisited the films for our conversation, how do you think the prequel works in relation to the original?
I think you said it really well at the beginning, that it seems like the prequel has gotten to the core, to the heart of what worked in the first film, and has emulated it and emphasized it to the point of total craziness. You know, it was tonally, I found there was the same energy or drive, but the tone itself was so different, and I appreciated that film felt really, really fresh to me, to, you know, manifesting that level of unhinged female characters. I fucking love it. Just give me more of this, honestly. And both Vera Farmiga and Julia Stiles is so great in these roles, and I feel like it's so easy to make a tragic, soppy mom that gets fucked over and tries to reclaim her independence out of this role. But both of them consistently deliver such multifaceted, ambivalent roles of women that are mothers, but they're more than just mothers.
I'm really glad you bring this up, because I think I wanted to talk about both Kate, Vera Farmiga's character in the first film, and Trisha, Julia Stiles' character in First Kill. What is Esther's relationship with the mother figure, and how do they play these very different types of mothers?
It's really, really funny. Let me set it up for the second film, and then I want to hear what your first impression was when the first 20 minutes of Orphan First Kill came about, when you're like, oh, this is going to be different.
Go for it.
So when we begin in 2007, I think, in Estonia, we have this background of Esther being in an institution. What kind of institution this is, we don't know at first. Turns out it's a mental institution, and she's the most dangerous patient there. So she makes her way out eventually. We see it stage by stage, kill by kill. It's quite fascinating how quickly it picks up its pace, this film, until she presents herself as a lost child. We can see her orchestrating it, choosing the child that she is going to impersonate, and then doing everything she can to find this family. And it is quite a rich, well-off family, even much better financially. They have a private jet, right?
My God, yeah, they're in the top 1%.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So she chose well. Like, girl, I feel you. Like, totally good idea. And to the point that she goes to this family that has just one other child who's a teenager. And yeah, their little girl has disappeared. They're happy to have her back. But there's something feels very off at first. And I could not put my finger on the main character of the mother at first. So that's why I'm more interested to hear what was your first impression of her.
I gotta say, Orphan got me again. I was like, oh, we're just gonna see the origin story of how she became a serial killer, maybe. No, Julia Stiles got me again. Rewatching this film, I could see the planting seeds in her performance more than anything. The way she reacts with such suspicion to the arrival of Esther, the way she, there's the moments that are obvious where she says, oh no, grandma died, oh, don't you remember this? But she knows that her child is dead. Esther doesn't know this. We don't know this. So I think the switch of Trisha when she's it's two performances going head to head. Because Trisha's performing for Esther, Esther's performing for Trisha, Esther is also performing for the rest of the family, and Trisha's also performing for her husband, not for her son, who she's buddy-buddy with. But when you realize what has been happening in this amazing reveal where Trisha just point blank shoots a man in the head, and then threatens to shoot Esther as well, and then sits down and they have a very business-like negotiation. She is so foul-mouthed and cruel. I love all those things, but I remember thinking they found a way to make Esther not the villain of her own story. And this is not really the making of Esther, because she was already a killer. She was already a hyper-violent serial killer that was locked away in an institution. She was already, she's weaponizing the way that she looks for her own purposes, namely to get out of the institution where she's in prison. But then Trisha has money. Trisha has status. Trisha has no qualms about killing people, about how she can cover it up, about how she can get away with it, and about the fact that she can buy Esther and she can buy her silence. The relationship there is like a little bit more clear than the weird tension of, that Kate had in the first film of, she sort of felt like she owned Esther because she had adopted her, because she has quote unquote saved her. But here, Trisha full on owns her. It's like, no. I own you. I can make you go away because I have more information and more resources, and I matter, but you don't matter. And the fact that she says words like that with such a blasé attitude, it very much reminded me of Jessica Lange in any season of American Horror Story. There's this sort
Queen.
of like, this sort of assurance of privilege. It was like, I'm not going to pretend like I don't like being me. Okay? You would like to be me, but you're not me. So you can shut it and you will have to do whatever I say you have to do. And the best and cruelest thing that she does, is when she goes, I'm going to go upstairs and fuck my husband.
He's never gonna want you. Did you think he would want you? Thank you. Since your arrival, he's been a new man. Now I'm going to go upstairs and fuck him.
Thanks for that.
Massive cuntiness.
It's
Love it.
exquisite. I don't watch The Real Housewives, world, but I imagine that's what it's like, but times 1,000.
In a way, I found this like extremely entertaining cinema value. I think in real life that would, enrage me massively.
Oh God,
but
yeah.
When it comes to film content, oh my God, I would lap it up easily. It's just so exquisite. As you said, that's such a good word to describe it. Very, very, very much so.
I kind of love that, these films. Well, I love that once we know that it's essentially a war between Trisha and Esther, how they both fight again without the poor husband, the poor dad, who is genuinely grief-stricken about his daughter.
He is the tragic
He really is. He really is, especially because at the very end, when the house is set on fire and he chooses Esther over his wife, and his wife plunks down, dies, and then Esther is like, "Oh no, I want Daddy in a different way."
And he's like, what about no?
But
it's like, off you go.
These films are so much about the parents as much as they are about Esther. And I love the way that the second film updates the parental figures to make them kind of both very innocent and genuinely, heartbroken and loving, to truly evil queen shit that Julia Stiles is doing there.
Yeah, so there's a lot of this film is quite versatile when you think about it. Both of them, when it comes to different aspects of grief or parenthood, and this is the thing which stands out for me thinking about Orphan and Orphan First Kill in comparison to other films that have evil children. Oftentimes, we end up having conversations about parenthood or pro-life or abortion or things like that come into the mix when I'm thinking about a lot of these films.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas here, it wasn't that much about parenting as it was about the parents.
Yes.
And I really, really like that. And thank you for bringing it up. Now I can actually articulate my thought properly.
The thing that I love about that second part of First Kill is that both Julia Stiles, Gunnar, the teenage son, who's a massive little prick. I hate him.
Oh my God. It's like, this is America. People like me matter. Go back to your Eastern European gulag.
I mean, not a word of a lie, but do you have to say it like that, dude? I also have to say, like, the language in this film and the second one is it's so fucked up. Like, it's so strong.
Off the charts. Off the charts.
I ended up just making notes while I was watching it of just every single insult that is hurled towards Esther. Like, with apologies, they call her a mutant grifter, illegal immigrant fugitive mental patient, psycho dwarf. Like, they call her so much shit that at a certain point I'm like, you know what, Esther, kill them all. Kill them all.
Which brings me to that absolutely fantastic sequence when she manages to escape Gunnar and Trisha in their car, and she puts her hair down, puts on sunglasses, puts the radio up, volume up, and the song that's playing is She's a Maniac.
Yes.
Absolutely great. I'm just sat there clapping up applause.
And you know what? It's also period accurate, because if she's born in the 70s, she's a Gen Xer. Of course she's going to be a Flashdance person. Of course.
It was so good. Like, such a way to reappropriate the insults and her own personality disorders in a way.
Totally. And, you know, Trisha and Gunnar are operating in deception always, because they're these like super privileged people, and Trisha supposedly runs this like philanthropic organization. It's all very vague. I don't need to know the details. But she's this like absolute monstrous figure that will cover up the death of her child and will happily kill someone else, and clearly is just like a terrible person all round. But on the surface, she's, you know, this community leader, whatnot. And the scene with the green shoes is one of my favorites in the film, where they're trying at a breakfast table to outwit each other without letting on what's really happening, and because Esther has put a full-on rat in Trisha's like super organic cleansing green juice that she has in the morning.
Oh gosh. That was so good. And I think that the scene was shot perfectly well, and the blocking was fantastic.
Yes.
Because we could see all of them almost at once. But yet the work with background and foreground really added a little bit of the comedic value as well. Because I think this scene also exemplifies that different levels of information access that we have, that you talked about earlier. Like what we know, what Esther knows, what Trisha knows, all of these, like, they fluctuate these levels all the time.
Yes.
And I really appreciate it when films cleverly and not overtly show us that through visual means without even saying anything, just like based on what you choose for background and foreground. That I thought was quite clever.
And I want to talk about a scene that directly, I think, speaks to the unmasking scene that we talked about in Orphan, which is actually the making of Esther's living doll sort of uniform, that style. And it's Trisha that gives her that makeover. You know, what did you make of that scene where we see all of these elements, you know, the Lizzie Borden chic that feels so out of place in the first film? This all comes from Trisha, we come to find out.
It makes so much sense, especially after having said everything that we've said about privilege and about the different contexts of where you come from and how different you are and how othered you are at the same time, coming into this extremely rich family where everything goes, I make the rules, is basically what Trisha is embodying all the time. It's a really good spin of the origin story, I think, and it makes sense because that sort of style is associated with a certain amount of privilege and lavishness that perhaps feels more at odds in the first film, in the second chronologically, but the first film overall. I thought that was quite clever. What about, was it something in the scene that struck you visually?
Well, it was the use of colors, actually. It was the pale pink. Trisha's a really fabulously cruel character. And I think rewatching the film, the layers of her cruelty come to the forefront. She dresses Esther as an even younger girl than when she is, and sort of in these old-fashioned girly clothes, and really insists on the pink, on the baby pink. She's almost drilling down through the uniform that she creates for her that she will always be perceived as a girl. That thing that she most wants, you know, to that the truth of her, that she's an adult woman, that she's, you know, closer to 40 than she is to 12. That's just not the world. That's not the life that she's allowed to lead. That's not how the world is going to perceive her at any point.
It is so interesting, like, listening to you talk about it in this way of thinking about boiling down the relationships between Esther and the mother characters in the two films, which are not mother-daughter relationships, even though we're perceiving them as such. It's quite fucked up, that thing, because they are a relationship of upmanship and female competition to a very toxic extent. And they're quite mirroring each other quite well. And really, I don't know, like, as any woman growing up under patriarchy, you have to constantly unlearn these mechanisms of comparison and pushing other women down in order to feel bigger, or all of these mechanisms. I have such a huge disdain for. It's part of the scary factor for me, I guess, in this film too. If I think about these relationships as such, I have trouble rooting for one or the other, but the filmmaking is so good, the acting is so good, and it's shown in rather subtle ways, so I give them a pass.
Yeah, and I do find these. It made me think of, want to hear more what you think about the way that Esther, throughout both films, relates to other women, because the main women that she interacts with are the mother figures.
And it's always a problem. It always starts off really well, and then everything comes down crumbling. And I find that quite sad on the one hand, but also, if you think about her origin, it also makes sense, not to be psychoanalyzing her character, but if potentially she was growing up in the 70s and 80s and in the Soviet Union and all of that, without the femininity and without being perceived as a grown person, let alone grown woman, of course that will fuck her relationship up with any other woman too. So in a way, that's not surprising to me, but what's surprising is to the extent and the depths that she would go in order to fulfill her needs. And you are right that it seems like the women are the more important characters, even if we see Esther's sexual frustration as the driving force. The men, they are not important. They're just some vessels, and they are mostly useless, both for her and for the mother characters. So in a way, I did say it's not about a mother-daughter relationship, but at the same time, I feel like this film is saying something crucial about the ambivalence of mother-daughter relationships and female relationships in general. Would you agree with that, or is it too far-fetched?
No, it's not. I think what's interesting, once you know the twist, once you know that Esther is an adult woman, it becomes about female competition. And it reminded me of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, which I think it's sort of, directly references with the rat scene. It's a really famous moment when one of the sisters in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane serves the other one a rat, a dead rat, instead of lunch. And it also made me think of Claudia in Interview with the Vampire, this child vampiress who is forever stuck in a 12-year-old's body. And she kills this adult woman and hides her in her bed because she so desperately wants to be a woman, for her body to catch up with her mental state, with her age. But because she can't, because she's a vampire and she'll never age, she then creates these mother figures for herself, like these vampire mothers, and sort of commits herself to being a forever child. Even though that's frustrating, it's easier than to deal with the enormity of being stuck in a child's body for eternity.
Yeah, that's such a great parallel, and yet Esther does exactly the opposite. Like, she would do anything but to make peace with that role, and that's quite fascinating.
Yeah, and again, like, it's this, sex becomes a huge barrier and a huge kind of motivator for the violence as well. And even her aggression, like, she's brutal as a killer. Like, she's so aggressive, but that aggression comes in, both it comes out both in the manipulation, in the stabby, in the hurting and threatening of the children. Which again, once you know that she's an adult, it's like, oh, you're a full grown ass woman who's telling a child that she's gonna castrate him.
Yeah.
Yeah. That happens.
Not a good look. Not a good look, Esther.
What do you think is the worst thing that Esther does across both these films?
Okay, so I have two answers.
Mm-hmm.
I think what made me feel the worst and worked for me perfectly in that point of the film was in the first Orphan, where she comes with the roses that she's cut off.
Yes.
Oh, that was awful. So basically, she supposedly gives her mom a gift to show her affection, but what she's effectively done is cut out the rose bush that is symbolizing the stillborn child.
Yeah.
Basically what she said, oh yes, as long as the roses are blooming, my child is always going to be alive. And Esther says, here, mommy, I got a present for you. These roses made me think of you. I thought that was so cruel and such a well-scripted moment.
Totally.
Very short, not violent in any way, but just psychologically crushing.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to a kill, I think my favorite kill would be from Orphan First Kill, the killing of Gunnar. Mm-hmm. Although I was very satisfied with this. Like, he really deserved to go.
Oh, yeah.
He was so awful with her, and then she goes at him with both a crossbow and a fencing sword.
Mm-hmm.
His own fencing sword. I thought, you go, girl. That was very satisfying. I want to hear yours, please, please, please.
Mine is nobody actually gets killed in this scene that I think is the worst thing that she does. But she, in the first Orphan, while little Max, sorry, I called her Sam earlier, while little Max, who's the death girl, she's sitting kind of strapped into her, kid's seat in the back, and Esther peeps into the car, puts it in reverse, and lets the car essentially roll down the street with this girl strapped into it. And she's understanding that something's going wrong, but she can't cry out, so they don't notice what's happening until she's like fully essentially rolling down a hill, and there's oncoming traffic, and this man tries to run to the car and get into the car to stop it, and he falls down, never see him again. And you just see Kate, Vera Farmiga's character, like running and screaming at the car, and it is another form of torturing Kate's character. But she has absolutely no qualms at putting Max, who she's at this point kind of bonded with quite intensely, putting her in harm's way, and especially taking advantage of Max's deafness to make sure that she's not gonna cry out for help until it's too late. It's cruel, it's physically violent, and it's cruel to two characters, particularly Max, who's been nothing but helpful even until this point to Esther. She's even sort of been like a little sidekick to her. And just in the way that it was shot, I thought it was so brilliantly shot, because a lot of the times the camera was it was being shot from the car. So you saw what was happening behind you. So the cars oncoming and swerving violently. And then you saw from Max's perspective, you saw her mother running and screaming towards her. And it was so dynamic and scary, genuinely scary. And also because it's the car's not, I have a low tolerance for car chases anyway. I don't get off on them at all. But something like this, when a car is just rolling backwards and no one is in control of it, terrifying.
Honestly, I think I've had more than 10 nightmares of certain situations like that. And
oh my God.
I do not drive a car, so it's
me either.
Very, very ridiculous why these are my nightmares. But yeah, I think what also was striking about the scene was how long it was.
Mm-hmm.
They really went full on in this. Really, really effective.
We haven't spoken that much about Isabel Fuhrman's performance. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts about her performance across both films, especially considering that in the first film, she was 12 years old, and in the prequel, she's 25 when she's playing Esther.
I really found this fascinating because obviously when I first saw First Kill, I didn't know none of this. So I kept like unwrapping more and more surprises and getting to grips with how this production came to be. And I was really, really impressed with her performance across both films, for sure, but also quite intrigued to learn that it was her and her, memorable role in Orphan that helped this film get made as a prequel. Just this real weird mess of real life stories affected by Orphan, people trying to return their adopted children and mixed identities, and there was some things happening in like 2014, 15, 19. It's just such a weird thing to consider, right? And she would be the receptacle for all of that, for a role that she starred in when she was 12 too. It's mind-boggling, and I cannot imagine for a child actor how much command you have to have, because I think that's what's going to stand out for me always, the preciseness of her gestures, of her speaking, of her walking, and the killings too. All of this was just specifically body acting that is so well calibrated. I thought that was probably the most memorable thing. And of course, it gives her presence a lot of weight. She's always a very hefty presence in every scene, even though she's supposedly this like cute little dozy child, right? So I think that's gonna stick with me for both of the films. But maybe you can help me tease out the differences, whether there are any, between the two films.
Well, I mean, you put it really nicely, because I think you're right. I think a lot of it is about the physical performance, but in a way that doesn't draw attention to itself until after you know what's happening with the plot. I watched them back to back last night, and it's very noticeable that she's, she looks a lot older in the second one, but I think the mannerisms and the way that Esther moves is very much the same. It's very much still there. And I think she's essentially in the way that she's cosplaying a child, an adult woman cosplaying a child. What Isabel Fuhrman is doing is a child cosplaying a woman cosplaying a child.
Yeah, exactly.
So
and I think that's fascinating.
It's fascinating because it's like, it's mannerisms, right? It's like, what do you think adults do when you're not an adult yet? It's like when you're a kid or a teenager and you're trying to get in to the club that's for over 18s, and you're 16 and you're essentially trying to act adult. What does acting like an adult look like? Do you hold yourself more upward? Like, how does that manifest? And I think that's what she's doing.
Yeah, it's a lot of it is, I guess, mimicking, but a lot of this is also invention of what you think it would look like. And here I really wanted to talk to you about this. I think it was in Orphan First Kill, this very brief scene when we see Esther in her room by herself. She is watching something on a small TV.
Yeah.
She's watching a film where I actually don't know which film that is. I don't recognize it. I really forgot to check in the credits what film it is. But this lovely scene between a little girl and her dad. She's calling him daddy. She's being physically affectionate to him. And that moment I thought was fantastic, because it's a meta move speaking to us about what cinema can be used for or misused, and alluding to the fact that she's tailoring her little girl behavior to movies like that. I found
Totally.
this subtle enough and like really, really rich and cool because there's another element of performance. And when you think about Isabel Fuhrman performing this, she's performing someone who is learning to perform, how to perform as a child.
Yeah.
It gets even naughtier, and I'm so excited by these things.
And also you know, going back to what we started this conversation talking about, it's also a, you know, let's call her Soviet, even though that word does not come up. But if we follow the timeline of the story, that's who she would be. It's a Soviet adult woman performing how to be an American, essentially. She's trying to get Americans to embrace her, which is a whole nother layer to it as well.
It's a really good convergence, I think, of different personalities and different cosplaying techniques, and they meld together really well. I don't think that's one of the best things perhaps about this character, that it brings these different it brings these different lines of identification together and tangles them into this knot that you cannot untangle anymore. There is no other character like Esther, I think, with my vast knowledge of European cinema across genres. So thank you, America, for giving us that character for once.
And, you know, I kind of want to briefly talk about the controversy, because you alluded to it earlier. And sometimes I struggle thinking, like, oh, is this going to be the film that's going to hit a nerve, like some sort of controversial nerve? But the first Orphan, as fun as it was, had this unexpected backlash of people reacting, thinking that it villainized adoption, and to the point where the film kind of has this pro-adoption message at the start of it, which, you know, it has nothing to do with real life adoption. It's a very, if it wasn't clear enough by our conversation, adoption is a very good thing, and adopted children are not Esther. But it also kind of then inspired, I don't know if you heard about this. I only heard about it maybe last year. In 2014, there was a real life couple who essentially, over a long period of time, abused their adopted child that they adopted from Ukraine, I believe, legally changed her age to, you know, being in her 20s when she was, I think, 9 or 10 or something like that, essentially inspired by Orphan.
Yeah, and I think she will also, like, the adopted child or the foster child had dwarfism.
She did, so yeah.
Even more, I really don't know. I think when I was looking at 2019. So that was just before they started shooting Orphan First Kill. That must have been a hitch, I can imagine. But perhaps, you know, I'm happy that it worked out that way. And even though this is a particularly scandalous and awful thing to surface in the media, at least I always feel like films bring conversations up. And as far as they can inspire people to do, like, awful things, people were also predisposed to do awful things before that. So, I always find it quite difficult to scale the demands made from horror films, the moralistic demands made from horror films. Do you feel like that this comes up when you talk to people about horror?
Not my people.
Exactly. That's what I thought as well.
My people are media literate.
So glad. I'm so glad. Like, this podcast stands for exactly that, and I'm so happy to be part of it.
And, you know, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, would you like to see more of Esther? Would you like to see another Orphan film?
You know what? Maybe not.
Fair.
I think I enjoyed rewatching them so much. And I have so many friends that I would like to share this film with and rewatch again and like have watch parties. And I think it's a rich enough film that wouldn't make me want to crave more development or more stories. I like the kills. I sometimes struggle to admit that I would like to see more vicious killings and stabs. And
it's okay. You
like
can
that.
You can say it with your full chest on this show.
I want more stabs. Basically, that's for almost every movie. For that reason, yeah. But I think the chance to fuck up the character of Esther, who actually we've managed to dissect quite well, and I think give a lot of very different entry points to. I don't want that to be lessened. I don't know.
I love that
Do
our
you
conversation has made you be more protective of this serial killer.
I don't know what that means, but I fully am embracing it. This is very much me very happy too. Do you have it in you? I need to know. Do you have it in you?
What?
To have another Esther?
You know what? Ordinarily, I would say no, but I thought that before watching First Kill, and First Kill was so much fun, and it was such a clever addition to a story that I thought was completely self-contained and remains being self-contained. But I think First Kill was just such a beautiful addition to it. Honestly, I'm open to being surprised.
In the right hands.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Although, please, no one legally change the age of your children because you're inspired by Orphan. That's child abuse.
Yeah. Don't use movies as excuse to do abuse in any way. Just do not abuse. Please,
generally,
do not abuse.
Yeah. And before I let you go, is there anything about Esther that you feel like we haven't discussed or haven't mentioned that you wanted to bring up?
Part of the little research that I did after I watched the film was that the original idea for Esther was a Czech woman, Barbara Skrylova, who apparently, as a grown-up woman, poses a 13-year-old and was caught in Norway, in northern Norway. And the real story is actually pretty bleak because she was adopted and she was abused, and the other siblings were also abused. So she escaped from basically taking the witness stand. But in order to escape, she had to pose as a 13-year-old. So knowing that, for me, what stand out actually was another Eastern European country came into the mix. Czech Republic, there's Estonia, Russia, Soviet Union, all of this, all together, making up this totally non-intelligible mix, I guess.
No, well, as Hollywood has always taught us, anything even vaguely Eastern European is automatically villainous.
Evil, evil, evil.
Sabina, thank you so much for coming on, for talking about Our Girl Esther with me. And can you please tell listeners where they can find more of your work online?
Yes, absolutely. I am on Twitter at Sabina Petkova, and I think my website still exists, sabina.work. I am usually reachable there, and on Instagram as well at Metaphysica. This is where I'm at, and I cannot thank you enough, Anna. This has been a dream come true and a totally lovely conversation. I am very fond of Our Girl Esther now. That's all thanks to our conversation.
Me too.
I couldn't have imagined a better episode, so it's absolutely great choice of films for us. I'm very, very pleased.
Me too. I've loved this conversation.